Avoidants can't handle what happens after this realization. Let me tell you something not enough people say. Avoidants aren't heartless. They're scared. They've built entire identities around keeping people just far enough away. Not because they don't care, but because they care so much that closeness feels dangerous. Vulnerability? That's a battlefield. And love? That's war. But here's the thing, they never see coming. One day, sooner than they think, someone will finally show up who doesn't chase. Someone who doesn't beg for attention. Someone who knows their worth. And when that person walks away instead of fighting to stay, that's the moment the avoidant realizes, I pushed away the one person who saw me and stayed anyway. And they can't handle it. Why? Because now they're face to face with something they've spent years avoiding. Consequence. The consequence of emotional distance. The cost of silent treatments and disappearing acts. The reality that love doesn't just wait forever. What happens next is uncomfortable. Avoidance will either grow or they'll retreat further. But here's the truth for you. The one who loved the avoidant, it was never your job to crack their code. It was your job to show up with open hands. And when they couldn't meet you there, it was your strength, not your weakness, to walk away. Let them face what they've been running from, because maybe, just maybe, that's the only thing that ever leads them home to themselves. Avoidants often get labeled as cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable, but these descriptions miss the deeper truth of what's actually happening beneath the surface. What many people don't realize is that avoidant behavior is rarely about a lack of care. It's about a deep-rooted fear. At their core, avoidants are not heartless. In fact, many of them feel emotions intensely, sometimes even more deeply than they let on. But rather than embracing closeness, they've learned to associate intimacy with pain, pressure, or a loss of control. So instead of moving toward connection, they pull away. This fear of vulnerability often stems from past experiences, relationships where their emotional needs were either neglected or overwhelmed. Maybe they were taught early on that expressing feelings led to punishment, rejection, or disappointment. Maybe they grew up in environments where independence was praised and emotional openness was viewed as weak. Whatever the cause, they developed a pattern of self-protection. Don't get too close. Don't rely on anyone. Don't let someone else get too much access to your heart. So when someone starts to get emotionally close, when the relationship begins to require a real exchange of feelings or a deeper level of intimacy, the avoidant starts to feel cornered. They may not even realize this is happening consciously. To them, it can just feel like pressure, like they're suffocating or like they're losing themselves in the relationship. Their response isn't always logical. It's survival mode. They shut down, become distant, or withdraw altogether, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay close without feeling overwhelmed. What's hard for the partner of an avoidant to understand is how someone who seemed so interested, so warm at the beginning, can suddenly switch off. The truth is, many avoidants are attracted to connection at first. They love the excitement, the validation, the comfort of being seen. But as soon as emotional stakes rise, when it stops being casual and starts being real, that fear kicks in. And instead of leaning in, they lean out. Avoidants aren't trying to hurt anyone. They're trying to protect themselves from what they believe will hurt them if they get too close. Their distance isn't proof they don't care. It's proof they've been hurt before, and they've built defenses strong enough to keep everyone, even the right people, on the outside. And unless they recognize the fear driving their behavior, those defenses can become prisons that keep them from the very connection they crave. Avoidants often go through relationships thinking they're in control. They believe they can keep people at a safe distance, maintain their emotional independence, and still have connection on their terms. They often assume the other person will always be there, always understanding, always willing to wait. But the moment that changes, the moment someone valuable stops chasing, stops trying to break through their emotional walls, that's when everything shifts. It's a realization the avoidant isn't prepared for because deep down they never thought it would come. At first they might feel relief. The pressure is off. There's no one constantly asking for closeness, no one requiring more emotional availability than they're ready to give. They can breathe again, convince themselves they're better off without all that intensity. But what happens next is what they didn't expect. The silence starts to echo. The absence begins to feel heavier than the presence ever did. And it dawns on them that person isn't coming back. It's in that quiet space where they no longer feel pursued that the realization sets in. They begin to see what they lost, the person who offered loyalty, compassion, and consistency. The one who tried to understand them, who stayed longer than most would have, has finally chosen themselves. And that's when the emotional armor that once felt like protection suddenly feels like isolation. This moment is more than just a wake-up call. It's often the first time the avoidant sees their behavior from the outside. They begin to reflect on the mixed signals, the shutting down, the disappearing acts, not as strategies for survival, but as actions with consequences. They start to understand that love isn't something people are obligated to keep giving, especially when it's not reciprocated. And realizing that someone valuable no longer wants to be part of their story is something they struggle to reconcile. What they thought was strength, keeping people out, now feels like a weakness because it didn't keep them safe, it kept them alone. And for avoidants who've spent most of their lives dodging emotional responsibility, this kind of clarity doesn't come quietly, it comes with a crash. The regret doesn't arrive immediately, it creeps in slowly when they see that person thriving without them, living fully, emotionally open, and no longer willing to accept less than they deserve. That's the moment that hurts the most. Because for the first time, the avoidant understands they weren't being strong, they were just afraid. And now they're alone with the knowledge of what they lost because of it. For someone with avoidant tendencies, love often feels safer when it's hypothetical, when it's still early, light, and non-threatening. They're more comfortable with the idea of love than the responsibility that comes with actually showing up for it. But when real love enters their life, steady, kind, patient, it asks something of them they're not used to giving. Emotional availability, consistency, and vulnerability. And when they're not ready or willing to meet that, they begin to withdraw. They may tell themselves the other person is too much, too emotional, or too demanding. But deep down, they're trying to protect themselves from the weight of real intimacy. What they often don't see in the moment is that love doesn't sit still forever. Someone can be incredibly patient, empathetic, and loyal, and still reach a point where they decide to walk away. That moment when the person who cared deeply chooses themselves instead of continuing to fight for the connection is where the real consequence begins for the avoidant. They might not feel it immediately. At first, it might seem like just another separation, something they've experienced before and believe they'll move past. But this time is different. This time, it was someone who truly saw them. Someone who loved them not for who they pretended to be, but for who they really were underneath all the layers. And that kind of love is rare. Losing it leaves a mark. The avoidant starts to realize that their emotional distancing didn't just protect them from pain, it cost them something irreplaceable. The silence that follows isn't peaceful, it's hollow. It's filled with the awareness that their defenses didn't just push away discomfort, they pushed away the one person who genuinely wanted to stay. The safe space they created by avoiding emotional connection now feels like a cage, and what used to be comforting independence starts to feel like loneliness. This consequence isn't loud, it creeps in through everyday reminders, a song, a memory, a moment of vulnerability they wish they had shared. The weight of what they lost begins to settle in slowly but firmly. And because avoidants are used to suppressing emotions, they often don't know how to process this kind of grief. They don't know how to repair something they only realized they wanted once it was gone. It's not just about losing a person. It's about losing the chance to be truly seen and loved. And for someone who's spent their life keeping people at a distance, that's the kind of consequence that lingers. When someone with avoidant tendencies reaches the moment of realizing what they've lost, they're forced into a kind of emotional reckoning they've spent years trying to avoid. Their usual strategies, shutting down, minimizing, detaching, don't work anymore. Why? Because for the first time, they're no longer protecting themselves from a hypothetical fear. They're dealing with the real outcome of their behavior. The distance they created wasn't theoretical. It pushed someone away, and that person isn't coming back. That's when something begins to shift internally. This is often the first time the avoidant is truly confronted with the emotional walls they built. Those walls didn't just keep pain out, they kept connection out too. And now standing alone behind them, they begin to feel the full weight of that choice. It's a painful, disorienting experience because it challenges the very foundation of how they've navigated relationships. What once felt like control now feels like emptiness. What once felt like safety now feels like regret. For avoidants, this realization can trigger one of two paths. The first is retreat, doubling down on avoidance, convincing themselves they didn't need that connection anyway, and numbing the pain with distractions or pride. It's the easier path, the familiar one. It allows them to avoid looking too closely at their own patterns. But the cost is high. They stay stuck, repeating the same behaviors in future relationships, always wondering why nothing ever feels right or lasts long enough. The second path is growth. It's the harder road because it requires real self-examination. It means asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I pull away when someone gets close? Why do I fear being seen? Why does consistency feel like pressure? Facing these questions means breaking down the narratives they've built to protect themselves. It means understanding that independence doesn't have to come at the expense of connection, and that vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's a bridge to real intimacy. This growth doesn't happen overnight. It's often messy and filled with resistance, but it's also the only way forward. When an avoidant begins to unpack their fears and see their behavior not as a personality trait, but as a survival mechanism, they open the door to change. They start to recognize that love doesn't thrive behind walls. It thrives in the space where two people are willing to meet each other fully. That space has always been available. They just have to choose to step into it. When you love someone with avoidant tendencies, it can feel like you're constantly proving your worth. You give more, you try harder, you stay patient, hoping that if you're understanding enough, gentle enough, or consistent enough, they'll finally let you in. You convince yourself that their distance isn't personal, that it's just how they are, and that maybe if you just love them better, they'll stop running. But at some point, something inside you shifts. The exhaustion becomes louder than the hope. The silence hurts more than the moments of connection ever healed. And you realize that loving someone doesn't mean abandoning yourself. That moment when you stop chasing, stop trying to earn closeness, isn't weakness, it's strength. It's reclaiming your value. You're not giving up on love. You're giving up on the version of love where you always have to prove you're enough. And that's a powerful decision. Because for someone who's poured their heart into an emotionally unavailable person, walking away isn't easy. It requires courage to stop accepting the bare minimum. It takes self-respect to say, this isn't love if it only works on their terms. What the avoidant often doesn't understand is that your leaving isn't about punishing them. It's about protecting yourself. You stayed long enough to know they weren't ready. You waited with grace, offered stability, and held space for them to meet you emotionally. But love isn't one-sided. You can't carry the connection alone. And the longer you do, the more it chips away at your self-worth. Leaving doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you finally started caring about yourself too. You recognize that your emotional needs matter just as much as theirs, that you deserve a love where your presence isn't seen as a threat, where close isn't met with resistance, and where communication doesn't feel like a minefield. You deserve reciprocity, not emotional labor. And maybe, just maybe, your absence will do what your presence never could. It might be the wake-up call they need. Sometimes, the only thing that forces someone to look at their patterns is the loss of the person who loved them anyway. But whether they change or not is no longer your responsibility. You're not their savior, and your love isn't a rehab center for their unhealed wounds. The moment you choose yourself is the moment you reclaim your peace. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally remembered how deeply you deserve to be loved in return. So here we are, at the edge of truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Avoidants don't fear love. They fear what love asks of them. And when the person who gave them the safest version of love walks away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, they're left to face the mirror they've been dodging all along. That moment isn't punishment. It's a powerful invitation to grow, to heal, to finally show up differently. But whether they accept that invitation or not, that's not your responsibility. Your healing doesn't depend on their realization. Your worth was never meant to hinge on their ability to love you properly. Because in the end, love isn't proven by how long you can hold on to someone who keeps pushing you away. It's proven by how boldly you choose yourself when they can't meet you halfway. Thank you for being here today, for listening, for reflecting, and for showing up with the courage to face what's real. Whether you're the one who walked away or the one just starting to wake up, know this: you're not broken, you're becoming. Every hard truth is a doorway. Every goodbye holds wisdom. So take what you need, leave behind what no longer serves you, and remember, the right love doesn't make you feel small. It meets you, sees you, and stays. Until next time, take care of your heart. You deserve everything you are brave enough to give. Thank you.